Tonight, can a president be prosecuted for official acts, even criminal activity, during his time in the Oval Office?
We have a big case today in the Supreme Court on presidential immunity.
The High Court hears arguments in a landmark case on presidential immunity. And a survivor's story.
Nobody knew what was going on. The army was caught by surprise.
As the IDF prepares to remove Hamas from Gaza, a woman who survived the October 7th attack shares her harrowing story. Plus,
these are incidents we usually see in large metropolitan communities, not in our smaller southern communities. So it's even more shocking.
How anti-Semitism is spreading across communities from coast to coast. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
The Supreme Court is considering a historic case that will shape this year's presidential election. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Tara Mergener.
And from the CBN studio here in our Washington bureau, I'm John Jessup. Well, at its final hearing day this term, a blockbuster case before the High Court. An attorney for Donald Trump tried to convince the justices that the former president cannot be criminally prosecuted for any of his official acts while in office.
The court's decision will determine whether and when 3 separate Trump trials can go forward. The justices' decision will also be a major ruling on the scope of presidential power. Washington correspondent Caitlin Burke listened to today's arguments. She joins us from the Supreme Court with the latest. Caitlin.
John, Tara, the focus of the justices' question for Trump's lawyer really centered around whether or how to determine whether an action taken in office was private or official.
In the special counsel's brief on pages 46 and 47, he urges us, even if we were to decide or assume that there was some sort of immunity for official acts, that there were sufficient private acts in the indictment for the case to go back and the trial to begin immediately.
The official stuff has to be expunged completely from the indictment before the case can go forward.
If you expunge the official part from the indictment, how do you, I mean, that's like a one-legged stool, right? I mean, giving somebody money isn't bribery unless you get something in exchange.
On the question of immunity, Justice Sonia Sotomayor pointed out that the Founding Fathers considered including this protection for presidents and decided against it.
They had state constitutions that granted some criminal immunity to governors, and yet they didn't take it up. Instead, they pass an impeachment clause that basically says you can't remove the president from office except by a trial in the Senate, but you can impeach him after. So, or you can impose criminal liability.
Michael Dreeben, the attorney for the Justice Department, expanded on that same argument.
The framers knew too well the dangers of a king who could do no wrong. They therefore devised a system to check abuses of power, especially the use of official power for private gain.
Dreeben argued the president doesn't need absolute immunity because layers of protections and legal safeguards are already in place.
The existing system is a carefully balanced framework. It protects the president, but not at the high constitutional cost of blanket criminal immunity. That has been the understanding of every president from the framing through Watergate and up to today.
Conservative justices questioned whether, without some form of immunity, existing safeguards would truly protect a president against maliciously motivated prosecutors.
The vast majority of attorneys general and Justice Department attorneys are honorable people, and they take their professional ethical responsibilities seriously. But there have been exceptions, right? Both among attorneys general and among federal prosecutors.
We are not endorsing a regime that we think would expose former presidents to criminal prosecution in bad faith, for political animus, without adequate evidence. A politically driven prosecution would violate the Constitution.
It's unclear when a ruling will come down on this case, but it will likely be the end of June, early July. John, Tara?
Caitlin, where do Americans fall when it comes to this case?
Well, Tara, with the former president once again running for office, this is definitely an issue that voters care about. In a recent poll from Marquette Law School, 62% of Americans said former presidents should not have immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. Only 20% thought that they should. Interestingly to note, though, when the poll specified if former President Trump should have immunity, that number jumped to 28%.
Well, Caitlin, of course, we've got an election coming up, so how are people looking at it through the lens of the presidential election in November?
Well, John, we're about 6 months out, but it is currently still a dead heat between Biden and Trump. Now, the latest polling from Quinnipiac University found the men both facing 46% support, and the election was top of mind for those outside the court.
The 2024 election is just so crucial. You know, it really comes down to, you know, are we going to have an authoritarian, you know, borderline fascist government, or are we going to continue democracy?
Come November, the nation will see if Trump's legal troubles will or won't affect him at the polls. John, Tara.
All right, CBN's Caitlin Burke. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Well, Mark Caleb Smith is the director of the Center for Political Studies at Cedarville University. He joins us now. Welcome to you, Dr. Smith. So this case examines whether the president has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution, or as we just heard Caitlin report, blanket criminal immunity that involves official acts. Based on today's oral arguments, Dr. Smith, what's your impression? Where do you think the justices will lean?
Well, it certainly seems like that a majority of the justices are not interested in a kind of blanket or across-the-board immunity for the president. Hypotheticals raised in the oral arguments about could a president order the military to assassinate his political rival, for example, and would that be, would that be under immunity as well? Would that be a public act? And President Trump's representative attorney said that it would probably be considered a public act and therefore would fall under immunity under his theory of how this should work. I just don't see a majority of the court kind of heading down that road. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to argue for no immunity whatsoever necessarily, but I think they're very critical of Trump's position.
You know, today the court spent a lot of time examining official acts and delineating between a president operating in his official capacity versus personal, or in this case, as a candidate. Why was that so important?
I think virtually everyone agrees that a president, a former president in particular, can be held criminally liable for their private or personal conduct. So, for example, if a president of the United States engages in reckless criminal behavior, drunk driving, for example, or worst case scenario, is involved in a murder that's disconnected completely from his official duties, everyone agrees that the law can step in and prosecute the president. The question here is, what about actions that are sort of blurring that line? Like in former President Trump's case, what about calling the Secretary of State of the state of Georgia and maybe pressuring him to so-called find votes in that kind of election? Is that Mr. Trump representing himself as a candidate, or is that him representing himself as a president? Would that be an official act, or would that be a private act? That's the kind of question that the justices were trying to tease out this morning.
Dr. Smith, if we can broaden the lens a little bit. So former President Trump did not attend today's arguments. He was, of course, in New York for the hush money trial. But how important do you view the Supreme Court hearing in terms of some of Mr. Trump's other cases?
It likely would not have much of an effect at all on the state-level cases. And so in Georgia and New York, I don't see this would have a significant effect. We're talking about really federal prosecution from the Department of Justice, part of the executive branch, of course, and whether or not they could carry that out against the former president. This would have a tremendous effect, of course, on those three other cases. And so if the court were to grant the president a blanket immunity, then all those cases would effectively stop. If the court comes down to some in-between position, this may delay those cases depending, or it may allow at least one of them to proceed. And so this, regardless of the long-term effects of this ruling, and they're going to be significant, the short-term impact could be dramatic as well.
All right, Dr. Mark Caleb Smith with Cedarville University, we thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Well, a new unrest today at colleges across the nation where students are demanding universities cut ties with Israel. It caused some Jewish students to fear for their safety as some protests have turned anti-Semitic. At the epicenter, Columbia University. The clock is ticking down to tonight's deadline to end the protests. In Georgia, more chaos as police and state troopers arrested more than a dozen students who set up tents on campus. Now, similar rallies are cropping up in Texas at the University of Southern California and Harvard.
My taxpayer money, everybody's taxpayer money, funding the killing of innocents. I won't tolerate it.
Meanwhile, the U.S. and 17 other countries are urging Hamas to release Israeli hostages. Hamas says it's willing to lay down its weapons if an independent Palestinian state is established with Jerusalem as its capital. Israel dismissed the offer and is moving ahead with plans to evacuate Gaza civilians ahead of its planned invasion of Rafah.
A teacher, a mother, a grandmother, and a survivor of the October 7th attacks on Israel. Adele Raymer was an eyewitness to the unthinkable, and Tara, now she's telling her story.
Incredible. Wendy Griffith joins us now with more on the story of one woman's courage in the face of evil. Wendy.
Yeah, it's incredible. Adele Raymer was on her kibbutz near the Gaza border the morning of the worst terrorist attack on Israel's soil in decades. She takes us back to that morning, hiding in a safe room, and how close she came to losing it all.
6:30 in the morning on October 7th, we started getting massive incoming rockets.
Adele Raymer was on her beloved kibbutz Niram, a small village near the Gaza border and home to some 400 residents, when they were told Israel was under attack. She and her son immediately ran into their safe room.
The problem with that is that the safe room does not lock. The safe room is built to keep us safe from rocket fire.
Hours went by as she followed the terrorist steps on her cell phone.
And just watching as virtually as houses are being burnt and people are being kidnapped.
Her worst nightmare, that something would happen to her daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren just a few houses away. Fortunately, her son-in-law, a first responder, was armed.
They burst into his house, and he told my grandchildren, hide yourselves under the blanket. You're going to hear a loud noise. Don't come out no matter what happens. He waited to see the door handle moving. He kicked the door open and shot the terrorist right in front of the house, in front of the safe room. So I almost lost my 3 granddaughters that day.
At one point, she heard the terrorists just outside.
My son said that he heard them being called away in Arabic. I looked at him, he looked at me, and told each other that we loved each other and basically said goodbye.
But then a miracle happened.
I opened the door very quietly and saw that the slats on my window had been broken. So they were literally starting to infiltrate my house. And dumb luck, divine intervention, or my late husband watching over us, whatever, they moved on. So we were safe for then.
Incredible story. So a narrow escape for Adele and her son. After 11 hours, they were rescued. But 5 people on her kibbutz were slaughtered that day and 5 were kidnapped. She and her family have relocated, and she's now advocating for the release of the Hamas hostages, many of whom she knows personally. Tara, John.
200 days in, still with hostages. Well, coming up, high-stakes talks in Beijing. Chinese and American leaders meet to avoid a potential conflict when Faith Nation returns. Welcome back. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called on China to level the playing field for American workers and companies in China. He's in Beijing meeting with senior officials at a pivotal moment in hopes of repairing relations between China and the United States. It'll be a difficult balancing act of promoting cooperation between the two superpowers while also tackling their differences.
We have an obligation for our people and indeed an obligation for the world to manage the relationship between our two countries responsibly.
The United States hopes to address several major issues with Russia. He also supports addressing China's support for Russia and its role in the fentanyl epidemic. Blinken arrived hours after President Biden signed a foreign aid package that included funding for Taiwan's defense against Beijing. The move outraged China.
And here with us now is author, columnist, and speaker Gordon Chang. Gordon, welcome. The Biden administration is moving toward a more restrictive relationship with China, economically and otherwise. How does he navigate what many say are the highest tensions in years?
I think it's very difficult to navigate. What you have in China is a militant state which is failing internally, which is threatening its neighbors, and it's run by one of the most malign figures in history. I don't know how you deal with that. And talking to China, sending our officials one right after the other to the magnificent Chinese capital is only feeding the already inflated self-importance of Chinese officials. So, no, I don't think what Blinken is doing is a good idea, and I don't know if there's any way to deal with this.
Along those lines, Washington and Beijing are at odds over how American companies operate in China. President Biden is urging for fair treatment of American companies to, quote, level the playing field. Gordon, can you give us examples of what that might look like? And is there any chance of that actually happening?
Well, there's no chance of that happening because Xi Jinping, especially during the last year, but also during the last half decade, has been narrowing the opportunities for foreign companies, for big ones like Apple and Tesla, and for small ones. And he's doing it, I think, in part because he realizes how successful foreign companies are and how much he wants to actually reserve the Chinese market for Chinese enterprises. So, you know, especially with these amendments to the counter-espionage law that were effective July 1st of last year, and with all the raids on U.S. companies, you know, it is just inane for Blinken to say, oh, I want to level the playing field, where we know that since China joined the WTO at the end of 2001, it has not adhered to its trade obligations. We need to start imposing costs. We need to stop talking to China, and we need to stop going to China.
Secretary Blinken, he's also going to press China to stop helping Russia's war effort with Ukraine. Any chance that could happen? No. China has been providing lethal aid to Russia for use in Ukraine from the beginning of this war. From the beginning of this war, President Biden and his administration have been warning China not to do so. And from the beginning of this war, we have not imposed costs on China. So, of course, the Chinese have ramped up their aid to Russia. And the only way to do this is for the United States to impose those costs. So, for instance, disconnecting Chinese banks from the global financial system, by sanctioning Chinese companies. We've got to do something. Talking to China is only going to give Beijing more time to aid the Russian war effort.
We only have a few seconds left, Gordon. Is there anything good that can come out of this meeting?
Yeah, that it ends and that Blinken comes back and they start imposing those costs. Anything short of that is not going to get us where we need to be.
All right, Gordon Chang, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and your insights tonight.
Thank you.
All right, bomb threats, vandalism, and terror. How leaders are battling anti-Semitism in America's heartland. Welcome back. From social media to college campuses, war in the Middle East is causing a huge spike in anti-Semitism all across the U.S. And many Jewish families are on edge as they celebrate Passover this week.
Paul Petit shows us how one state is working to keep its Jewish communities safe.
A county patrol vehicle guards Lubavitch Jewish Center in Little Rock, Arkansas.
We work together with law enforcement to make sure things can operate in a safe way.
At nearby Temple B'nai Israel, tiny pieces of broken glass remain as evidence from an act of vandalism.
I can't say how it happened, but it certainly has never happened before.
Both are examples of growing anti-Semitism across America's heartland. Since the October 7th Hamas attack, Little Rock synagogues have been the target of 2 bomb threats, creating safety concerns for Jewish congregations.
These are incidents we usually see in large metropolitan communities, not in our smaller southern communities. So it's even more shocking. It's even more unsettling to hear that the Little Rock community, the Little Rock Jewish community, is so deeply impacted.
A recent national survey revealed anti-Semitism to be at its highest level since the Anti-Defamation League began tracking the data more than 40 years ago.
Nationally, ADL is reporting out over 3,300 incidents of anti-Semitism reported to ADL since October 7th. So since the war between Israel and Hamas broke out, that's over a 350% increase in anti-Semitic incidents.
Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders calls the right to worship freely and safely our most fundamental right, but nothing existed previously to aid those who were at possible threat of a terrorist attack. So the governor's office worked with the Arkansas State Police and the state legislature to address it.
And basically what it does is it provides funds for organizations that are spiritual or religious-based nonprofit organizations to enhance their safety protocols and to make sure that they are able to offer safe worship for their congregants.
After its approval to provide $500,000, more than 31 applicants responded with requests seeking more than $2 million. So far, $227,000 has been awarded to 6 organizations. Of those 6, 4 are Jewish, including B'nai Israel and Lubavitch of Arkansas, which plans to continue paying for a police presence and adding unseen security measures.
So we were very gratified and thankful to the governor who made this initiative to help reduce the concern and the fear factor that presented itself in the community when this took place on October 7th.
Combating anti-Semitism is a centuries-old battle. Offering funding for protection is one way Arkansas is fighting back. In Little Rock, Paul Petit, CBN News.
Thanks, Paul. Coming up, a donation worth celebrating with confetti. Next on Faith Nation.
And finally, tonight, a sports writer turned a Super Bowl keepsake into money for charity.
The idea centered on the 2020 Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl win. Sports writer Nathan Taylor with The Athletic was covering the match and grabbed handfuls of the post-game celebration confetti. He shared it online, testing to see if folks would donate to have a piece of it. As nearly 2,000 donations came in, Nate started mailing confetti out all over the world. On Wednesday, he delivered a nearly $10,000 check to the Ronald McDonald House to benefit families with sick children. Who would have thunk it?
No, that's an A for creativity.
A for
and
creativity
heart.
and heart and good cause.
Okay.
Thanks so much for watching.
We will see you tomorrow.